Welcome to the 2 for 20 podcast. It's just two guys for 20 minutes on faith, family, and figuring it out. Here are your hosts, Lewis and Jim.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Are you recording?
I am. We're good. Yeah, we're live. We're as live as a podcast.
I'm gonna start over. That's no. Let's not go. So, for the folks at home that may not know, we usually, we come up with these topics, right? And what you guys may not know is that one of us will come up with the topic, and the other has to speak about the topic, and usually with no preparation. And it's very challenging, but we do it because we want to have a more honest conversation, right? So I thought tonight, Jim, we would talk about atheists. What do you think about that?
Okay.
Atheism, and not just atheists, but how should we as believers in God, as Catholics, how we should treat atheists, and maybe try to understand why some people become atheists. What's behind all that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting topic. I didn't see it coming. Like you said, we try not to share with each other. I mean, occasionally we'll kind of give a little sneak peek if it's something we're kind of nervous about, or I don't know, a bigger topic, but I didn't see this one coming. So this is interesting. I would say this, that generally speaking, it's a topic that I find to be wildly fascinating. The philosophy that underlies our theology, includes within that tradition in the church is things like the arguments for the existence of God and a lot of stuff like that, which helps to kind of approach atheism or atheists, or people who might not kind of know what those terms are. An atheist would be somebody who professes that there is no God, someone who would affirmatively say God does not exist, there is no God. Philosophy usually is the best approach when entering into dialogue with people who would do that, as opposed to theology, like you wouldn't necessarily bring a Bible to a conversation with an atheist, because they're more than likely just kind of dismiss it as just kind of religious practice. So you kind of need to start at a more foundational level. So anyway, I'm talking a lot, but I would say this, that I think this is really interesting. So I'm curious to see where you want to go with this. So I'll flip it back to you.
No, I think that was great. I think we definitely have to talk a little bit about that, and I like the what you said about approaching it from philosophical aspect, right? But before we get to that, maybe we can talk a little bit about what would cause a person to become an atheist, right? Because I think a lot of it, if we can think about why someone becomes an atheist, it may help us understand their frame of thought, right? I don't know. I feel like a lot of people become atheists because of some disillusionment, or because maybe they prayed to God and they did not receive what they wanted, and now they just kind of have given up, or because they have been betrayed by or they feel they've been betrayed by God, or the representation of God on earth, right? So maybe they were betrayed by the church, maybe they were betrayed by someone who they trusted, or a figure who professed to be very religious and God-fearing, but turned out to be something else. There's a lot of misinformation out there too that may make someone change their mind about whether they believe in God or not, right? I don't know, what do you think about that? What do you think of some of the reasons that people stop believing in God?
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe the first thing, to be fair to people who might be atheists or identify as being an atheist, or kind of have this position, because there's a little bit of a distinguishing characteristic. So you can maybe kind of bracket people into one of three categories. So you can say there's theists, right? People who believe that a God exists. And then you can kind of from there go into different understandings of God or whatever. And then you'd say there's atheists who would affirmatively say there is no God. And then there's this middle ground of people who would probably identify as being agnostic. So the people who would say, I'm really not sure. I'm waiting to find more evidence. I'm not prepared to make an affirmative yes or no. They're just kind of sitting on the fence, if you will. So just to be fair, I think kind of understanding those different categories, but I think generally speaking, somebody who would fit into either the atheist category or the agnostic category, there's probably a ton of different reasons. And I think the ones that you mentioned are probably the most common. And in this is gonna put on my nerd hat. So St. Thomas Aquinas, who's my favorite saint ever, a 13th century Dominican philosopher and theologian. I even have on my books back here, an abbreviation of St. Thomas's Summa. And I'm not going to read, literally, I can tell you where this bookmark is, and it's going to be right on the argument. This is, I swear, we did not plan this, but literally that's where the page is, right? So it's only because I teach this, so it's familiar, so I know it's there. All right. I promise that was not staged. That was not staged, right?
That's good.
Aquinas gives, in his Summa, his writings, he gives an objection to, or like an argument against God's existence. And it's kind of more modern language understood as what's called the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And it basically goes like this. If God is all good and God is all powerful and God is all knowing, then God would know about evil. God would want to destroy evil or do away with evil, and God would have the ability to do so. Right. And so he would know about it, he would want to do away with it, and he would have the ability to do so because he's all powerful. But evil clearly exists in the world. So therefore, God either doesn't know about it, doesn't care about it, or can't do anything about it, or God doesn't exist. Right. And if evil exists, or the way St. Thomas puts it, he says, if one of two contrary, this is super nerdy, if one of two contraries be infinite, like if you have infinite heat, it destroys coldness. Right? If you have infinite heat, it destroys infinite cold. But if God is infinite goodness and love, that would destroy all evil. And if God is infinite goodness, but evil exists, therefore God does not exist. Right? And that's his argument against the existence of God. And we understand it today as the problem of evil. And you mentioned it. It's people who have an experience of suffering, an experience of, Lord, I prayed for my grandmother not to have cancer, and she did. And I'm really mad at you. So maybe you're not there. And so I reject that you're there. Or I can look around and see that like this natural disaster just destroyed an entire city and thousands of people are dead. Where are you, God? And so that is, I think, probably the most profound argument against the existence of God. It's this idea that how can all good, all knowing, and all loving God allow for evil and suffering and horrible things to exist? He must not be good or powerful or knowing, or he probably just doesn't exist, right? And that's the argument against it. So yeah, I would say that's probably the most common one. And for most people, it's not like a philosophical argument. It comes from an emotional, experiential place, right? Like it comes from a place of like, I lost my job. I lost my wife. My kid has this problem. Like I'm struggling with whatever, like the normal sufferings of everyday life. And the idea that like, hey, I prayed for this to come to an end and God's not taking away my suffering. So, you must not be up there, God. So I'm out of here. You're not real. And so, so I think that's probably the most common experience for people who would say they're atheist,
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me ask you this: how should we treat atheists? I mean, because I've seen people, and I'm not going to say who, but I've seen people actually say to others, "Hey, you don't believe in God? I want nothing to do with you." And I wonder if that's the right approach, right? Because if anything, I think it negates what God wants us to do. I think, if we see someone who doesn't believe in God, I think that with more reason, we should be that example of Jesus, right? Where we accept the person, right? We don't have to believe the same thing he believes, right? Or not believe, um, or she, whatever, So, but how do we engage in a conversation where we demonstrate that we're followers of Jesus, but at the same time leave room to, for understanding and for saying, well, I understand why you feel this way, right? And when, if ever, can you make that transition from saying, hey, I understand where you're coming from. I don't agree with it, but I believe in God. That doesn't mean that we can't be friends. That doesn't mean that we can't, have a good conversation. And is it ever appropriate to kind of teach about God and maybe explain why we believe in Jesus, and it's the very example of how we're treating them, with respect, with love, as a brother or a sister. Um, is that a good indication of us as followers of Jesus and setting a good example for them?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
No, I hear you. And I would say, like, I don't know of a lot of cases. I'm sure they exist, but I'd be willing to bet, you know, an entire paycheck, a year's salary. I would be willing to bet my mortgage that in the history of the church, more people have been brought to Jesus Christ and brought to conversion because of the example of Christian love, the example of sacrificial love, modeled after the life of Christ, rather than philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Like, people are not converted and brought closer to the Lord Jesus because they heard a really compelling, philosophical argument. Now, some people are, like, that's fine. Some people's experience is that, but the majority of people who experience, Christian kindness. So I don't know, you mentioned somebody, like, basically saying, like, if you're an atheist, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to be friends with you. Like, I would tell that person, I don't want to be friends with you. Like, I wouldn't want to be friends with a Christian or a Catholic who doesn't want to be friends with an atheist just because they're an atheist. Like, be friends with someone because they're a nice person to be friends with. Don't be friends with someone because they believe in God or don't believe in God. Like, you know, I would find that to be, like, absolutely disgusting from a Christian perspective, that somebody would reject another person because they don't believe in God. Now, maybe that means that they manifest in some kind of hateful or, unattractive personality, whatever. But that's not because of their belief system. You know what I mean? Like, I would say this, that, like, I actually, like, so, working with confirmation students over the years, I've said this over to different teenagers in groups or whatever, that, like, I would have more respect on a human level for, like, a young person, a teenager, or even like an adult who, like, is willing to argue against the existence of God, and they're willing to argue passionately and with conviction, than some lukewarm Catholic who does not know and does not care about the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that atheist is wrestling. They are struggling, and
Right.
yeah, they need help to maybe understand better, or maybe to believe better, or have better examples set for them. But at least they're wrestling. But the Catholic who sits on their couch and is like, yeah, I believe in God and, whatever, but they literally do nothing. I mean, I would refer to them as kind of a practical atheist. They profess belief, but they have no actual evidence of faith. Like, their
Right.
life demonstrates no reality that God exists. So to those people, I would say, like,
Yeah.
see you later. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would say an emphatic 100%. Like, I'd love to have conversations with people who struggle with belief, but people who care, like people who are truly seeking the truth. I think that's amazingly interesting and worth entering into dialogue with.
Yeah, and you said it right there. I mean, the key is that, they're seeking the truth, right? And they're doing so, passionately, and they're engaging, and they're not, their belief is not based, or their lack of belief is not based on some whim. It's on something that's true, right? Or maybe an experience that they're having, but it's true to them. So yeah, and and I always tell everybody, even my children, I say to them, always ask questions, right? Ask questions of our faith, ask questions of our church, because in asking questions, that's when you truly get to the truth, and the fact is that, not everybody's an expert. You know, and you know, eh, not everybody's an expert, and you need to stay open. You need to stay open because um, you don't, going back to what you said, that lukewarm Catholic, you don't want to be, um, you know, uh, do things halfway, right? You don't want to, um, what's the term I'm looking for here? Like, um, and maybe we'll edit this out. My train of thought. But, going back to this idea of, engaging that atheist, and seeking the truth, because those of us who know that God exists know that, um, and understand that this atheist may be going through this process because that's what God is allowing them to go through. Because we've known of so many cases of people who have been atheists, and then all of a sudden, uh, understand and start believing in God, and they are better Catholics than, Catholics who have been cradle Catholics or Catholics who have been Catholics their whole life, right?
Okay.
So, um, and I love the way you said that. Always seek the truth, man, because that's where you're gonna find God.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. I in my conversation today with my students, actually, it came up, and I said to them that the truth is intolerant, right? When you kind of come to a realization that something is true, or you make a truth claim, and like in this case, God exists, God is real. Like we're making a claim to that being true, right? And likewise, if an atheist says something like God does not exist, right, they're making a claim to that being true. Now, both of those statements can't be true at the same time. So something is off here, right? And so if there's an honesty among the believer and an honesty among the atheist, there should be dialogue, there should be conversation, there should be argumentation, and not argumentation like shouting, like modern internet argumentation. Like that's just idiots shouting at each other, name calling. I'm talking about like presenting a case, presenting like evidence, you
Hmm.
know. And so I don't think as believers we should be afraid of that. And I think to me, like, I love this part of the church is the nerdy academic part because it's almost like, and I've described it like this. I think of it as it's like the foundation of a house, right? So we were just talking a little while ago about like, buying and selling houses and stuff like this. Like one of the things that if you're going to go buy or sell a house, like whatever the price range that you're looking in, like you probably don't want to only look at like what color are the walls, like, oh, did they choose a gray or is it a blue? Is it a nice off white or is it like who, like that's fine, but who cares? Like you probably want to know most fundamentally, like, is it in my price range? How are the taxes? Like, is the foundation solid? Does it have fire damage or water damage? Like, is there rot in the wood? And if the foundation is good, then like you can build off of that all of the beautiful things that we love about living in a house or buying or selling a house, which is like, the style and the decorations and the furniture, right? But if you don't have a good foundation, right? So back to God, right? So having a faith life that's meaningful, sometimes we like to think of it, and this is why I wonder, as I think we like to think about it like it's the furniture in the house, like, oh, it's the warm fuzzies. It's kind of the like, hallelujah, praise the Lord, and everything feels nice, Jesus, whatever moments. But if you don't have a firm foundation, like a firm understanding and reasons why you believe that God exists, it's eventually going to crumble because you're going to experience suffering. You're going to experience hardship. And when you do experience hardship and you feel like God's not there, or you feel like abandoned, you feel lonely in your faith life, if there's not a firm intellectual grounding into here's the reasons why I'm confident that God truly does exist and this God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, then you can build up from there. So you got to have the good bones, if you will, the good foundation, the good structure of this. So yeah, so then when it comes to having conversations with people who are struggling with beliefs, people who are pursuing the truth, you're not just presenting a case that says like, well, I believe in God because, I feel nice when I go to church. Well, like, whoopity do. Like, there's lots of people who go to church and don't feel nice. Like, that doesn't mean God is real or not real. It just means you feel nice. There's some people who feel nice when they go bowling. Like, that doesn't mean that bowling is God. It's just whatever. Like, so emotions are nice. Feelings are nice. Emotions sometimes are bad. Sometimes emotions make us feel sad and lonely and frustrated about God's seemingly non-existent presence. But it's really kind of that grounding. I think that kind of should give us stability, because the world is going to be jockeying us back and forth. Anyway,
Yeah,
I'm
and
talking a
I
lot.
think that's no, yeah, and I think that's part of the problem, right? You talked about having a good foundation, right? So, I was brought up in the faith, you were brought up in the faith, and our parents gave us a foundation, right? They took us to CCD, we did our baptism, we did our sacraments up to this point, and that's a foundation, right? But that's part of the problem, right? That a lot of people don't have that foundation, and even if they do, they lose it. It's not strong enough for them to continue on believing, right? So let me just ask you a question, because I know we're coming to the end of the show, and I'll ask you this. You meet someone, or maybe it's a friend at work or a colleague, and you find out that they're an atheist, right? And you say, you get into a conversation, and he or she confides in you that the reason they don't believe in God is because, I don't know, my mother was sick with cancer, and I prayed, and I promised that I would do, and I prayed, and she still died. She succumbed to the disease and she died. What do you tell someone like that?
Yeah. Well, first off, I work for the church. So if I have a coworker, namely a priest who doesn't believe in God, we've got big problems here. All of that aside,
Let's not get into that. That's a whole different episode.
That's a whole other thing. All right, but more seriously. No, I would say this. All right, there are two ways to respond. One would be like an academic response. And I would say if you go with that response, you're an idiot and you should get slapped in the head, right? Like if somebody's expressing like a broken heart, like a poor suffering soul, a poor suffering person, and they're crying out saying, God's not here. He's not consoling my broken heart. If you go and present to them and say, well, here's St. Thomas Aquinas's arguments, like take that and go ahead and slap yourself in the head, because it's just cruel. It's insensitive. I would say this, and I've had this opportunity where it's kind of come up to me, and I don't think, number one, I think what's important is to acknowledge is that there is no perfect answer to this. Like there is an element to our faith life where we have to make a leap of faith. And we can't know perfectly in the same manner that we know other things more clearly and perfectly, like 2 + 2 = 4, or, whatever, some natural scientific formula or something like that. There's an element of this to mystery. There's an element to this of faith, and that's not going to be consoling to a sad heart. So the only thing that I would say that you could offer to a coworker who's suffering like that would be friendship. Natural human friendship, to love them the way Christ wants you to love them. And I think if you bring that to them and you do that daily, you do that regularly, and you show interest in them as a human being, not as like a fixer-upper, not as like a project for you to convert, but rather just as a human being, that allows the Lord, who is the one who eventually is the reason why people come to faith, not because of arguments, but it allows for the Lord then to work through that relationship. So I would say that just be a friend. If someone's suffering and they're saying God doesn't, just say, like, just be a shoulder to cry on, be a friend, visit them, talk to them about whatever,
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. It's gotta be, and it's funny because you said suffering, right? And suffering can lead someone to stop believing, right? But suffering can also help someone believe
Yeah.
in God again, right? So I think if you acknowledge that suffering that person is feeling, that person is going through, and maybe not even mention God at the beginning, but kind of say, what you're feeling is real. I totally understand where you're coming from, and not be judgmental. And like you said, offer friendship, offer a shoulder to cry on, right? But not forget about the suffering, right? And when appropriate, if an opportunity presents itself, remind the person that, someone suffered for us too, right? And that suffering is real. That suffering was real as well, right? And the same way Jesus suffered for us, and excuse me, the same way Jesus suffered for us.
Well, how about this? Let's save it, because I think there's a lot here we could talk about, and I
Yeah.
think the conversation about suffering is like worthy of its own episode, or even its own 10 episodes, because it's such a profound topic. So maybe we do that. Maybe we table it, because we're kind of running towards the end of our time. So maybe we should save the conversation of suffering. But to your original question about atheism and dialoguing, I would say maybe what I'll do is I'll include, we can include in the notes on this, the description on this, a couple of links. The best place for me that I think to go to, if you're someone who is interested in the conversations about atheism, conversations about arguments for the existence of God in the kind of modern new media, is Pints with Aquinas. So Matt Fradd, shout out to Matt Fradd. Maybe he'll have us on his show or something. I think he's a little big time for us. That's all right. He runs a YouTube channel and a podcast called Pints with Aquinas, and I'll link in the description, which does a great job of talking about philosophy and theology. And a lot of these topics are covered on his show. So I would definitely say check that out.
Yeah, great. That's a great resource.
This is good. This has been fun. Yeah. So we'll hopefully see you all next week. Thanks for joining. Thanks for watching.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you next week.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, make sure to share with a friend. See you next time. Bye. God bless.